titles that Sophia just read was a collection of World War II books that I started to work on about 15 years ago. And I was the son of a World War II vet, and I think though I kind of shied away from the subject as for writing for many years, it was part of my background. My father was a Navy vet, and he was someone who didn't talk like so many vets. Was someone who didn't talk about his experiences much. But if you grew up in that era as a son or daughter of a vet, you know that it was always sort of became a part of the family history. And so it was always sort of lurking in my background. And after freelancing and starting to focus on writing history, mainly magazines, and as was mentioned, I worked for PBS for a while. I started to get a yen to write books, and I looked to World War II as a topic, and it felt fresh to me 15 years ago in middle age. It felt like a fresh topic, which I was grateful for, and I could approach subjects I thought differently than I might otherwise. So I started first writing books about little narratives of what I thought were unknown and unlikely incidents in the war that people would be interested in. And I wrote a little bit about the invasion. I wrote a book about the invasion of North Africa, and touching a little bit on the Moroccan-French resistance movement as part of that story. And I got involved, I got interested in writing about resistance movements that were largely unknown to the reading public. And a couple of years after that, I found this story about the Dutch resistance, about three very young girls who were involved in the Dutch resistance. Two of them were actually teenage sisters. A third was in her first year as a college student in Amsterdam. The story struck me quickly. The headline was that they were assassins, saboteurs, and I found it just hard to imagine teenage girls being assassins in the Dutch resistance. So naturally, I was drawn to telling their story. I did. It's called Three Ordinary Girls. It's quite a popular book. And it's quite a fascinating story which I'm not going to go into. You're going to hear enough about Denmark today, so you don't need to confuse matters with stories of the Netherlands and teenage girls. At any rate, after doing that book, I was looking around for a new subject, and I still felt that I could tell another resistance story. And I knew vaguely of the story of Denmark, and I'm going to give away the headline of this book, which is the story of the heroic rescue and escape of the Jewish citizens of Denmark during World War II. I started to dig more deeply into that story after actually finding the obituary of one of the sisters, the two teenage girls in the Three Ordinary Girls. I found her story in a New York Times obituary. That's how I got onto that subject. When I moved off to tell the story of the Danish resistance, it was again finding the little nugget of, and it was not really a nugget. The escape and rescue of the Jewish citizens of Denmark was well known, especially in the Jewish community. But I thought it was little known in this country, outside of the Jewish community. I thought it was worthy of a book, and I started to dig deeper into it. But there were some immediate questions that I had. How did they do it? First of all, how was it? How did it transpire? The 8,000, just under 8,000 Jews in Denmark were able to escape Nazi oppressors and find safety across the strait that separates Denmark and Sweden, and in Sweden. And there was also the nagging questions about beyond how they did it. Why did the escape took place in 1943, which was 3 years after Germany occupied Denmark? Why did it take so long for this to transpire? And in these questions led me to questions about where the Danes were lauded for their aid to the Jewish community and for their help in rescuing those Jews and getting them across the strait. My skeptical self said, is that really what happened? And so I wanted to find out more about the escape itself. Those were the sorts of questions that drove the book and let me know that I was writing a book and that I wanted to tell this story. I'm going to do my own introduction of Jack, and then we're going to start talking. And I'm going to assume you have some questions after reading the book, and we could talk about that. Jack Elhai is a longtime friend of mine, and on the phone the other day, I referred to him as the dean of freelance writers in the Twin Cities. He demurred at that description.
Because it makes me sound old.
Exactly. So I'm going to call you the eminence grise. Worse?
Let's go with Dean.
I thought you might opt for Dean. Anyway, Jack, what he is a true mensch. He's a guy who helps writers within this community, and he's been doing it for years and years and years. Aside from being a great writer, a great historian, a great guy for bringing up interesting, fascinating topics to write about.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I read Tim's book a few weeks ago, and there were some things. I've written a World War II related book myself, and there were some things that I found in Tim's book that I had not known. One of the most intriguing aspects of this story was something that comes out in the beginning of the book, and it was the odd, probably unique relationship between the occupied Danish government and the German occupiers. It was unlike any occupation relationship anywhere else in Europe, I think. Can you tell us about that?
It was a curious situation. It was the Germans swept into Denmark in early April 1940, and the Danes themselves were unprepared for the assault, and they quickly acquiesced to the demands of Germany and the occupying force, and it was a combination of factors that led to that. Denmark had been a neutral country in World War I. It had not been in a war since the middle of the 19th century. It was a country that was not looking to fight anyone, and it had purposely not joined any arms race that might have been happening in the 1930s in Europe. So it just was not prepared for war, and it knew that, and so that was why they quickly acquiesced to the power of Germany. Was if I can back up just a moment to tell you, I also started this book about Denmark during the early days of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it was it was one of the things that was interesting to me about that was how a great power occupies lesser power in the modern age. But that carried over into my work on the German Denmark book. Anyway, the Danes agreed, the king and the parliament agreed to become a protectorate of Germany, and the agreement was such that Germany allowed Denmark to keep its military, including army, navy, its civil service, its court system, even its police, and the Danes. One of the things that the Danes insisted upon, in exchange for this, was that Germany respect the civil rights of Danish citizens. This became a crucial point when it came time, when Germany decided that they needed to clamp down on Denmark, which was a point that came when the resistance began to grow. And we can talk about that. Once that happened, it became more and more important that Germany kept its hands away from the civil rights of the Danish citizens.
So as a result, many Danes, perhaps including even the Jews of Denmark, didn't feel all that occupied for a long time.
It's true, and Denmark did not suffer the same sort of economic privations that were present throughout Europe during the war. It was basically the agriculture and manufacturing remained pretty steady, and Germany was one of its, if not principal, one of its leading markets for goods and services and manufactured items.
I thought another interesting aspect of this wartime political mix was there was yet a third country involved in the rescue and escape of the Jews of Denmark, and that was Sweden, which was a neutral country, yet accepted these escaping Jews and probably took a risk by doing so.
And it should be noted that they came to that acceptance a little late in the game. All of the Sweden did not. In fact, it was sort of a last minute thing that Sweden agreed to accept the refugees from Denmark, the Jewish refugees from Denmark, and one of the people involved in convincing Sweden, its king and its parliament, to accept these 8,000 or so refugees, just under 8,000 refugees, was a visit by the famous physicist Niels Bohr, who's a well-known Danish citizen, one of the world's great physicists. much in demand at the time because of his he was assumed by both the Allies and the Axis to be crucial for the development of the atomic bomb. And those who have seen what God, they're blanking on the name of the Oppenheimer, will remember that there was sort of a cameo appearance by Niels Bohr in that movie. And anyway, Niels Bohr is a figure in this book, his story. He also had sort of a hair-raising escape himself. Niels Bohr was his mother came from one of the leading Jewish families of Copenhagen, and so he was not a practicing Jew. I shouldn't say that. I don't think he was a practicing Jew. He was not a devout Jew in any sense, but he became very much a part of the community during the crisis, and he became one of the more active members again in the. There's something that I give these talks, and there's 100 different things I can think of tossing in, and I can't shove them all in fast enough or with enough clarity to help you understand. But there are a lot of factors that I have not mentioned so far. One of which is the speed with which all of the roundup of the Jews was demanded by Germany, and the speed with which the Jews of Denmark were carried over the Sound to Sweden in this rescue escape operation. It was it was essentially over in 2 weeks, from Rosh Hashanah in 1943, the end of early October 1943, by the middle of October, almost all of the Jews in Denmark had been transported to Sweden. Bohr was one of the Jews who left a few days early prior to this mass escape. He went over and made his arguments with Danish authorities to help convince them with Swedish authorities to help convince them to allow Danish Jews into the country.
Who are some of, besides Niels Bohr, some of the other figures populating the book who you like to talk about, or who you were pleased to get to know through your research?
The principal, I should say principal, one of the major characters, the most dominant character, was a guy named Jürgen Keeler. And he was a member of a family, the Keeler family of Horsens, Denmark, and there were 4 siblings who were part of the resistance during the war. They were the children of a doctor in Horsens, and Jürgen and his brother Fleming were med students at the University of Copenhagen. They had 2 sisters who were also students in Copenhagen, at the University of Copenhagen. They lived in a flat in downtown Copenhagen, and they became, initially they became helped to organize the rescue and escape of the Jews of Denmark by raising money, finding boats, finding means to get refugees Jews from their hiding places in Denmark to the usually fishing boats that would transport them across the Sound. But their story goes on. They became, ultimately, Jürgen in particular became one of the leading figures, and it was called Holger Dansk, which was a Danish resistance movement. The name, it's named for a mythical figure in Danish lore who was actually a knight in the Camelot story. He was again more stuff. I'm going to avoid that now. But if my children were here sitting in the front row, I would have detected eye rolls already.
You've talked to us a little bit about how you chose this topic, but once you chose it, Denmark is far away from here.
Yeah.
So how did you do your research, and how did you handle all of that in this massive
Well,
effort?
we went to Copenhagen for a couple of weeks. Meaning my wife back in the corner there, along with a succession of our two children, joined us in Copenhagen, and 1 week at a time, and we toured the city. I had a graduate student in history guided us through. I will say that she was, and this is, we found this true of Danish historians in general. They're kind of bored with the World War II story of Americans coming over to ask about the rescue of Danish Jews. So she wanted to steer me towards, I don't know what her particular interest was, but it was something that was not quite mine. So we were at loggerheads a little bit. But so we spent a couple weeks there. The Keeler, one of the things that I always look for when I'm doing a narrative history is to find a voice that I can really latch to and use that character to help me tell a story. It gives me that sense of when you're doing a narrative history and you want to get a real close sense of what a feeling was, what it felt like to do this, that, or the other thing, without having the interviews lined up, and it's getting harder and harder to do World War II books without World War II vets or to tell their story. So Jürgen Keeler wrote a memoir of his experiences that became sort of well thumbed on my desk, and the fact that his story carried on after the rescue of Jewish citizens, and into he spent time in one of the harshest of the concentration camps after the war. He continued in the resistance and became more daring, and his acts of resistance became more consequential. So he became someone sought after by the Gestapo, and all of the Keelers, his brother Fleming, and their two sisters all spent time in the camps, and with more or less grave consequences. And the sisters had Elizabeth, who was the oldest sister, and an interesting character in her own right, spent I think 3 or 4 months in a concentration camp. Benta, who was the other sister, spent maybe a month or 2 less than that. Jürgen and Fleming became camp mates, and they went from 2 camps, 2 concentration camps in Denmark, which were the least cruel of the camps that were involved in housing resistance fighters. But they were ultimately transferred to German concentration camps, and they had
you find that the activities and approach of the Danish resistance fighters was like that of the Dutch resistance that you wrote about earlier?
No, for a couple of reasons. One, the Dutch story was far more isolated, meaning that it was centered on a small cadre of resistance fighters in Haarlem, which is outside of Amsterdam. And it was isolated to, I followed the activities of these three girls pretty closely, and they were in a very small group, and that was only peripherally involved in the big picture of the Dutch resistance. So it was a more compressed look. In the Danish story, the Holger Dansk was part of a larger resistance group. There were, just to give you a sense, the Holger Dansk was abbreviated as in the subsection that the Keelers worked in. It was called HD2, and there were about there was HD 3, 4, 5, up to 6 or 7 HD Holger Dansk resistance groups, and so it was a much larger peek at that world in this research. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the Danish resistance was any more or less effective than the Dutch resistance. In fact, it may not have been as effective.
After the war and after the Germans were gone, did Jews return to Denmark?
There are about 8,000 Jews in Denmark right now. So immediately after is a positive story. The Jews who came back, and I say that with an asterisk, because you can't, I mean, the experience of being a refugee, just the upset of that life, of your life being shattered and being pulled away from your home, even if you're safe in another country and have some circumstances, and the Swedes provided them with were caring and helped provide them, along with Danish groups that helped organize their arrival in Sweden. But it's an upsetting thing, as you can well imagine. It's just and they went there, they came back. There was an immediate effort on the part of the Danish government after the war to aid the returnees. There were funds that were dispensed by the Danish government. And you must know that this is pretty unusual for the times. That this was unusual. Especially after the devastation of the war, that a country would use some of its funds to aid anybody, and so when the Jews came back, many of them were aided by Danish social services. This is there are always going to be stories where this didn't happen, where there was more Jewish suffering. They came back to ransack apartments, but there was actually not too much of that. Again, it's a feather in the cap of Danes in general, I think, to say. And one of the things I should say that in looking at my early decision to do this work, I again have this skepticism that tells me that stories that sound too good to be true are quite often too good to be true. And so I always wondered, well, I approached the subject with the Danes really as wonderful as they're made out in these tales, and I think I can say after going through the subject at some depth that they did it awful. They did wonderful things, and there are there are stories that don't boost that notion, but you know, in questions like this, you really have to put it in a historical weight, and I think that it can be said that the Danes did yeoman work.
One of the things that's so wonderful and intriguing about this book and your earlier books too is how you follow the threads of people doing things at this particular time, and yet there's bigger things, you know, bigger war happening beyond these events, and you give us just enough of that so that we feel that we have the context and can feel the danger and the immediacy for the people who you're following. And I've always wanted to ask you, how did you learn to do that?
Well, you know, I've actually thought about this, and I think, you know, I first as a reader, I think I like books that move along, which might be contradictory for someone who studies history. But one of the great compliments, I think, for my writing is I couldn't put it down. And it ranks right up there with I learned something. So it's, I think that helps me speed things up. And also, again, it's I always think of my children rolling their eyes, and so I tend not to dilly-dally on subjects that I think are going to bore people. So.
Yeah, children are really useful in that way.
They are really useful.
So now that this is completed and out, today is the first day of the release of the book, right?
Yes.
The
Yes, it
publication date. What are you thinking of beyond this?
I'm thinking of retirement. I don't know. I really know have no topic that today is really stirring me, but I must say that it gets my juices flowing again to get out here and do these talks, and I like to see people. I like to I like to write books, and I am at an age where I don't have much better to do than I hope that doesn't sound like jaded in any sense.
Do you think this is a good time to open it to the questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Have at it.
So I haven't read the book yet, and I don't know if this is a spoiler, but what were the ramifications for the Danish people once the Germans figured out the Jews were gone?
It's an interesting question. They didn't suffer greatly. There was always this sense amongst Germans, and this is going to get into the weeds a little bit, but the government or the protectorate that was set in place by Germany, there was a sense that one character in particular, his name was Werner Best, was the head of the Germans administration in Denmark, and there was a sense amongst historians that he was never so he was never really eager to put a hard fist down on the Danish population. And to the extent that even as they were, even as Jews were escaping, he was quoted by someone, and this is might have been apocryphal, but he was quoted as saying it would be better to build a bridge across that sound. And the notion being that the Jews were leaving Denmark one way or the other, and if they did it by fisher boats, that was as good as by sending them, and cheaper than sending them off to concentration camps.
Was there, among the resistance, was there any thought or effort to undermine the German war effort?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, was it, I mean, the broader war effort, not just, I mean, because Denmark had already launched.
Yeah, there was the resistance was slow to begin in Denmark, in part because the resistance leaders and Danes in general thought Germany was going to win the war until 1943, when Germany was turned away from Stalingrad, when North Africa was lost by Germany. Italy was in the process of being lost, and suddenly it became evident to many people that Germany was going to lose the war, and there were Danish resistance figures who suddenly realized that if Germany lost the war and the Allies won, they weren't going to look that good to the Allies because they had I don't want to use they hadn't suffered nearly as much as other nations in Western Europe, and so there was a sudden shift of gears, and the resistance became, there were more people joining the resistance, and there were more efforts to sabotage the German war machine, as such as it was in Denmark.
There wasn't a Quisling figure in Denmark?
No, that was, but Norway played a consequential role in what was happening in Denmark, and one of the things that Danes did not want was what they called the Norway example. They didn't want that Quisling figure. That was another reason why they were happy. The king of Denmark, Christian X, remained in power throughout, and actually became sort of a revered figure to the Danish people. And it's too complex to give a full outline of Danish governmental and monarchical reactions to what was going on.
Tim, you live in St. Paul, Dean Elhigh, you live in Minneapolis. And I think it's wonderful to see how literature can bridge that divide. Bring you together.
I thought of coming here on a fishing boat.
My question, Tim, I was wondering if you mentioned the journal, but were there other surprises or discoveries in your research that got you excited and you thought this is something that maybe hasn't been written about yet, or
You know what?
fresh?
We went up to the coast, the coast of Zealand, which is the island that holds Copenhagen, and which is the most populated of the Danish provinces, is just chock-a-block with fishing villages and villages of all stripes, and they all had some connection to the escape in one facet or another. Either they had fishermen who were part of the effort to rescue Jews, or if you were on the water. Oh, here's one tiny thing. It was one of the reasons that the Germans were a little lackadaisical in rounding up the escaping fisher boats is because the escape in early October happened at the height of herring season. And so the waters in the sound were just filled with genuine fishing boats, and so the Germans didn't know who the hell they were gonna stop, because they didn't know if they would stop and find holds full of escaping Jews or holds full of trying to escape herring.
I'm curious about the relationship with the Germans and the Danes in the early period.
The what?
Did
Who's in the
the German and how they kind of played nicer with
Yeah.
Denmark?
Yeah.
But did the Jews have the same deprivations that they did in the other countries, like, ownership's taken away?
No,
and
this is
housing?
one of the crucial factors in all of this is, and I haven't really talked about the Jews of Denmark very much. There was a community that began that first arrived in Denmark in the early 17th century.
Mhm.
And so they had a pretty substantial history in the country, including in the early 1800s being granted full citizenship in Denmark, which was highly unusual. So that was, they fell under the rubric of the civil rights concern that was paramount to the Danish people in general, and was one of the points that was insisted upon with this initial treat for Germany when
So they continue to have all the same rights as a Danish citizen up
and
until.
one thing that the Danish government did was they remained true to that promise to the Jewish people throughout the occupation.
So they didn't have to register as
No,
Jews?
and there was an old saw that Christian 10 wore a yellow star throughout the occupation in allegiance to the Jewish community. There was never a yellow star in Denmark. No Jews wore yellow stars in Denmark because that was part of the that would have been against the civil rights. It would have been not a civil right for.
I'm having a hard time with the Nazis respecting civil rights, but, so I'm wondering if there was there a special affinity because they border, they're Aryan, was there some feeling from Germany like this is okay to be Denmark?
The southern, I also have a map of Denmark right here, and the southern part of Jutland, which borders on Germany, there's a province called Schleswig, and it went back and forth from that war that I mentioned in the mid 19th century, which was also with Germany and Denmark. That province went back and forth and between Germany and the Danes, and it was a largely German-speaking province, and when many of them, when Germany rolled across the border at the start of the occupation, they were guiding German troops in the right direction and there a few Nazi salutes as they cruised past. So there was a strong affinity even in southern Denmark for the Germans who were coming in.
Was there anything that popped out at you in terms of what happened as events were unfolding when the Germans first arrived, that seem to have something in common with what we've been living through in the last 7 months?
That's a loaded question. Yeah, I really am sort of loath to make that sort of comparison. I think that you have, just judging, if I may, judging by your question, I think you've made some some observations that, but
Well, I guess what I'm thinking of actually, it's one of the, I was interested in your book, but I'm really thinking about what causes people to be heroic.
that's a
Because
very
like
good question.
the Norwegians really did resist the Nazis, and they paid for it, and they have museums to the resistance, and it's not old business to them.
Right.
So it's interesting that it's kind of old business in Denmark. But I'm really thinking about, what those of us who, are kind of concerned, what's gonna move us to be heroes in
Yeah.
this time? And I guess that's what I wonder, if the essence of that heroic thing.
It's a question that I've asked myself. What is the essence of, why did the Danes do what they did? And I think that it's a question that is of great importance right now at this time, because it's a moral question, and they were acting morally, and I think it's safe to say that we could be making the same sorts of judgments ourselves, and I can't, it's hard for me, I keep going back to this, the Danish people had an unusually strong sense of self, an usually strong a sense of their rights as a people and as individuals within the people, and they extended that to the Jewish citizens in the country, which is unusual. It's, which was unusual at that time, and why they did it. I don't know what the weight of things was. There was anti-Semitism in Denmark, no question about it. It was never as strong as in Germany. It was never as strong as in other parts of Western Europe. What makes people not be so judgmental, not be so horrible?
Not be horrible, that's the word. Yeah. And I know you're not representing the United Nations or anything
Yeah.
like that, I get that.
My sense from reading your book was also that the Danes had a strong, a unified sense of what was right
Yes.
when
Yeah.
it came to human rights and governance.
I think that's safe to say, yeah.
And this fell into that category, that if one group of citizens is threatened in this way, what is right is to help them get out.
Yeah. That is true, safe to say. Yes.
I just read not too long ago, and I'm wondering if this fits in with some of what you're saying, that the Danes had gone from being a rather large power and losing all of that to this, and how that affected their attitudes.
That's, this is regretfully, I probably should have followed that guide who I was talking about deeper into Danish history. So I would be able to respond. It sounds feasible to me, knowing just a touch about older Danish history. Yeah, they were a larger power prior to modern times, and maybe they losing some of that power influenced who they were as a people.
Well, the book I'm reading says just that how much over time that has made their attitudes what it is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
could be.
Yes.
Yeah,
one of your premises is that the Germans allowed business as usual for commerce when they
Yes.
occupied the country.
Yes.
How unusual was that for their occupied countries? And the reason, it's a kind of a personal question for me, because my son works for a Danish company that was founded in 1943 in Denmark, so
Really?
I'm wondering.
Well, this is one of the, that doesn't sound unlikely to me. Of course, I'm not gonna question your son or you, but.
He wasn't there, so.
No, the reason I responded that way is that, there was some, melding of economics and businesses at that time between the two countries. They were not, it wasn't Germany didn't come in and take over all businesses, and they were not interested in doing that. They wanted to do business with the Danes, and they wanted, in particular, they wanted the agricultural products of Denmark, the cheese and milk and dairy products in particular, to help feed the country that their own people who were deep in war and were stretching their own resources to wage those wars. So Denmark was sort of provided help in that regard to Germany.
Maybe this would be a good time to stop. I just want to get the last word and congratulate Tim for carrying this through. It's a wonderful book. I learned something from it, and I couldn't put it down. And I think, Tim, you'll be signing books
I will
down
be
that way.
signing books that way.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Next.